Welcome back to Vendée Radio. Today is November the 29th in the year of grace 2022, and it's my great pleasure to be joined by Mr. Jason Craig and Mr. Marc Barnes. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Well, Jason is returning to Vendée Radio for the third time. He's spoken previously with me on the land movement and on Catholic festivity. He is the editor of Those Catholic Men and Sword&Spade magazine and the author of Leaving Boyhood Behind. Mr. Marc Barnes is also an editor at the new Polity journal and think tank that aims to investigate and construct a Christian post-liberal worldview, recognizing that the defining characteristic of human societies is their fundamental orientation towards or away from God, which sounds a mission statement that's sorely needed today. And together, myself, Mr. Barnes and Mr. Craig are going to be discussing guilds, work, the dichotomy between ownership versus wage slavery, and more generally, the theme of lay associations. There's been quite a lot of talk about the breakdown of community in late modernity and post-modernity, the collapse of third spaces. And guilds represent an interesting Catholic form of association which sort of spans both second spaces, places of work, and also third spaces. And to an extent, first spaces as well, because they were very much familial institutions. So we're going to explore the origin of guilds in early medieval Christendom, their apogee in the High Middle Ages, the Late Middle Ages, the reasons for their destruction, their dissolution, why they were targeted by the fallen angels as Christian institutions, and how we might revivify them in our own time. So I'll begin with a quote from Leo XIII. This is from Rerum Novarum. He said, quote, "History attests to the excellent results that the workers' guilds of times past achieved. They were the means of affording not only many advantages to the workmen, but in no small degree of promoting the advancement of art, as numerous monuments remain to bear witness," end quote. So I think what Pope Leo's alluding to there is that they are not just simply economic organizations, as we're going to see. They had social and religious functions. They were the institutional expression of the traditional, warm, intimate, yet formalized urban civilization of Catholic Europe. So let's first of all look at their establishment. Mr. Craig, Could you perhaps elaborate for our listeners about the origins of guilds?
No, that's a loaded question. And I only say that jokingly, and this is at the beginning for the listeners. You fans of Mr. Howard will already know this. I'm just warning Mark. The problem with our host here is he reads way ahead of where you've read, and he knows so much, and then he's able to articulate it eloquently and beautifully, and he understands it. So I'll give my best, but you can jump in at any time, Theo. I would say the rise of the guilds is somewhat organic. And my reference for that would be the kind of broad sweep of history that someone like Hilaire Belloc would give in the Servile State, that there is a natural propensity in man, social creatures, all of that, that when we have jobs that need to get done, that will do, that we are able to do better when we have other people with us. We have a tendency to find ways to work together. And it's not true at all that we tend naturally, and I'm speaking from growing up in a very Southern American blue collar context, and also living now rurally and on a farm, that there's not it's not true that there's a tendency for us to separate and go to our cabins and to have everyone leave us alone. That actually, just because we have a little more room on our property for animals and gardens and such, we actually are very intertwined because it's helpful to have other people to call upon. This happened to me today. I'm supposed to be off and at home taking care of a new baby. We came into fall with very little water, and where I live in the United States, fall is when we grow our grasses, for our cool season grasses for the winter, and we stockpile them in the fields, we let the grass grow in the fall. That's when the grass grows, not to sound technical. And but this fall is dry, so I have cows. We have a very small dairy and some beef cows, and we have them on another friend's pasture because he had grass, i.e. he didn't mow. And I went outside today, and there was a cow out walking down the road because something had gone wrong. I signaled to a neighbor. When I say signaled, that's to sound medieval. I actually called him on my cell phone. I called him. He met me. And then I realized there were some pigs out. The pigs were the neighbors whose house the cows were at, but the pigs are also owned by someone else. So I realized, I was talking to my friend, there's like 7 people intertwined with this problem that we're fixing right now. I don't even know who's really responsible. But the point is, we all in this little section of land have a mutual dependency and mutual working together that's necessary. So that is how I think, in a very organic way, I'm saying the necessity for our guild, so to speak, in this little spot that I have, is born from just the fact that it's good for us to be together for our work. And there was some beauty in our conversation afterwards about things we're reading. I was actually sharing an article I finally got around to reading from New Polity, because that tome, when it hits, you got to sit down and have some time. You got to have a baby to read through New Polity completely, which I did just in time to get through the summer issue. So I think when we talk about where they arose from, is the fact that the Roman Empire had collapsed. The largest political power had collapsed. There was, the chaos that we might know and call the Dark Ages after that. A lot of times erroneously what people mean by that, but clearly disarray socially, and that there's a natural propensity for men who are working and have care for a particular place that they don't intend or have no imagination to leave, with their family and their customs and the land that they know, to associate together to preserve in a sort of foundationally safe, natural ways of life, i.e. growing enough food to not die. And then if they happen to be Catholic, that is sanctified and brought into order even further. And I think there are times when even when the church herself is in disarray, that those guilds can find themselves strengthened even further, because they realize, a lot of us can speak in the United States, particularly of lay movements that bring about the conversions of large amounts of people, and somewhat and almost in spite of the worst and best efforts of the average parish system. So there's all sorts of reasons that we, and I say we, households, particularly the men of the fathers of homes and households associating together for religious, social, but at beginning, so very practical reasons. So we have the collapse of Rome, the fall of Rome. We have the monasteries, the loose but consistent spread and growth of Christianity. We have the necessity of agrarian life. We have particular seasons, places, and then we have the beauty of Catholicism. And to summarize, in the Middle Ages, these things just gain more social order. They gain more. They wrote these things down, like the books on your desk, which I couldn't find. We've been discussing or wanted to discuss. They brought these things into a really worthwhile solidification, and they protected one another and they looked out for one another. And there's some people, depending on your disposition, whether you look at these as limiting factors, that they were limited because you couldn't make candles in this town unless you were part of the Candle Makers Guild. Or you can see it as a beautiful necessity that, good grief, I wish there was a Candle Makers Guild I could send my son to become a candle maker in our day and age. But is that sufficient? Would you add to that?
No, that accords with my research for this discussion. Myself and Mr. Craig have both been reading this book, The Art of Solidarity in the Middle Ages. It's basically an in-depth study of guilds in England from 1250 to 1550. So this is really the crescendo of the guilds in England in the high and late Middle Ages.
Yeah, that definitely represents the height of them before any kind of decline. That
right.
What they had achieved is truly amazing, and it did continue. I mean, even into the New World. I lived in St. Augustine, Florida for a time, and it was beautiful to walk around the town where there's these little squares from the confraternity, and the confraternities very much hail in spirit from the guilds. The confraternity of this or that would make these little city parks in the middle of St. Augustine, Florida, for no apparent utilitarian reasons other than they would gather there and do whatever the confraternity of the, bruised hands of Saint Joseph would do.
Right. So in Spanish, they're confradías. They are confraternita in Italian, confrere in French, Bruderschaft, so like brother work in German. And in guild, we get guild from the Old Norse gildi, so payment. But I think you can see in those Romance languages the close association with lay religious fraternities. And that's what really struck me in researching the origins of guilds, is that actually some of the guilds arose from religious confraternities. Yeah, I thought it was the other way around, that confraternities arose from guilds, but actually often the economic associations arose from religious associations. Right. And if you go far enough back, it's actually, this is drawing from the monasteries, of course, which begin as lay associations. And that provided a model for self-formation for the laity. And it might be that the laity that lived near to a monastery followed that example of that structured self-formation and formed a confraternity for their particular trade, whatever it was. And you touched on how it was familial, and that was, the family was the main social factor in the Middle Ages, the natural social factor. So a family of clockmakers might establish its own workshop, and then gradually through several generations, that workshop would become a small industry, a cottage industry, employing many other workers to do its jobs, do various jobs under the direction of the family members. That same process would take place with other families of clockmakers. They would then associate and develop a set of laws to govern that specific business. And then you'd have a statute based on the needs of that industry, the relations between the owners and the employees, which would then govern the industry of clockmakers in that specific area. And the medieval state would recognize the legislative power of those guilds. Mr. Barnes, sorry.
Yeah, that's quite right. And I think that order is important. I mean, in the history of the development of the guild in medieval Spain, it really did begin with lay associations, which were basically for spiritual purposes. I see the confraternities and really just lay associations generally as an attempt to fulfill in the Gospels that very mysterious command of Christ, to seek ye first the kingdom of God, and then all these things shall be added unto you. And what shall be added unto you? Well, precisely the goods that we consider as a part of our material life, our economic life. These are the things that Christ tells us not to worry about, but instead to seek first the kingdom. And I think often in our individualistic sort of psychological age, we can imagine Christ commanding something to the effect of, well, just don't worry. Just don't even think about where you're going to get bread and where you're going to get what you need to feed your family. Just pursue other spiritual ends as if they were extrinsic and disconnected from the attainment of material ends. And then somehow magically and extrinsically, God will provide. But in the unified idea of Christendom, it was precisely the opposite. By first pursuing spiritual ends, these confraternities provided for themselves material comfort. What I mean is something like this. I mean, when you look at the history of Spain, the first things these groups were doing, these lay associations were doing, is actually gathering on the basis of some either common work, but often just a common location, a neighborhood, an area, and aligning themselves under the patronage of a particular saint. And this, for the specific purpose of doing honor to that saint and seeking his intercession. And some of the first rules, and again, we're talking about a diverse quilt here. This is, when you're talking about the history of modern states, it's very easy to say, well, first this, then that. But when you're talking about medieval Christendom, it's sort of like, well, let's look for some patterns within this mess. But some of the first rules were things like no member of an association here can fail to attend another member's funeral when they die and pray for their soul. So what was being sought after was the kingdom of heaven in the sense of a eschatological sense, like that person would be in heaven, that we would that our souls would be saved was in fact the effort that was establishing these people into unity. And they even went so far as to say that if you didn't show up at the funeral, you would be fined. So there were certain Christendom was never afraid of law. We actually got very excited as Christians about law because it was precisely when you hit on a good custom that freely came from the spirit of the Gospels, the idea of codifying it made as much sense as the idea of, carving a statue to your hero or something like that. But anyways, this is to say that the pursuit of spiritual merit meant that these groups on the feast day of their particular patron saint would parade from their place of meeting to the cathedral church, usually, where they had an altar to that saint that they would decorate with their own banners. And so you can imagine, as these various lay associations all cropped up, how you would have a very diverse community life that would simply be a result of the pursuit of spiritual merit. Another thing to note is that all of the confraternities, especially in Spain, would take part in the Christ the King or in the Corpus Christi, I think, processions, where they would be represented precisely as that group, with their particular emblem, with their particular saint. And then what happened, though, is that as you seek the kingdom, part of seeking the kingdom is performing the spiritual and temporal works of mercy, or the corporal works of mercy. So these groups developed a concern for taking care of widows and orphans. So it wasn't simply sufficient that you go to your brother's funeral within these societies. You then had to care for the widows and orphans. But this meant that there was already, by the very nature of seeking to live out the gospel, material demands. And so money was pooled, resources were pooled for the sake of mutual care and assistance. Long before we even dreamed of insurance, where we take care of each other by mutually investing in market economies, there was the sense of taking care of each other through simply sharing in what we have. And you can see, I think, I say natural, but it's really quite a grace-filled course from which the pursuit of holiness, the pursuit of spiritual merit, begins to gather to itself material resources and culture, right? So now you even get to the point where in medieval Spain, that confraternities started to replace, in many instances, civil courts. Why? Because when two members had a disagreement, they brought it to the confraternity itself to settle. And this wasn't simply a matter of, private disagreements concerning certain matters that only the confraternity could presumably take care of. This is real, potentially violent situations in which one person is claiming that the other is a thief or something like that. Now, again, it's not simply that. What is being showed here is that Christianity has, in its own pursuit of the kingdom, the resources to provide the totality of life to believers. It's not like providing for the spirit while it waits for something else to provide for the flesh. The people were able to, you think about the other very mysterious part of the gospel, or actually this is part of the Pauline letters, where St. Paul says something to the effect of, we should be ashamed to go to court before unbelievers. If we have arguments among ourselves, we should settle them among ourselves. Well, the confraternities, which later developed into the guilds strictly, were already taking the gospel at its word and saying, here is the format, right? Within our mutual spiritual search for merit and for the honor of the saints and for mutual aid and assistance, we have the resources to judge between ourselves those conflicts that might arise, and they really did. And so you can see how within Christendom you have this possibility, obviously a road not taken, right? But the possibility of a diverse and I should say it like this: a possibility in which Christianity really does become the air we breathe to such an extent that the institutions we form for love of Christ and his saints also become the means by which we live out the very material necessities of this life, of judication, of insurance, and then ultimately, of course, of trade and craft. So
I think I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, please.
No, I think what you're bringing up right there is the difference, though, and the distinction that people try to make of saying, well, we'll be spiritual over here and practical over there.
Right.
And you're saying, no, these things are solved within the logic, within the normal living of the gospel, particularly in the fact that they're called confraternities, or what was the doing work together? What was the German?
Bruderschaft.
Yeah.
Brother work, yeah.
That, the very clear, I love the letters of the New Testament, of the Pauline letters, but even John, of just constantly St. Paul saying, yes, can't you work this out because you're brothers? Do you really need to go to court if you're brothers? St. John saying, this is actually the defining feature. This is how you know you've moved from death to life, when you love the brotherhood, that the fraternal, familial, that we actually are bound to one another, has very, very practical effect in how we deal with one another.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people take this, again, to be a sort of something extrinsic to the basic Christian method, as if being Christian were its own thing, and then by a kind of further stretch of the spirit, you can utilize it for the sake of universal brotherhood or something like that. Mm-hmm. But when you look at a baptism, what happens? You take a child, you baptize them, and what do? You give them a new father and mother called their godfather and their godmother, and they're immediately inaugurated into a new familial relationship. Because, Jason, if you became the godfather of my child, in the Middle Ages, it's not simply that there would be a vertical relationship, if you will, between yourself and the child, though of course that would exist. There would also be a new relationship between you and I, and it would be called copater. You and I would be copater to each other. And we still have in Latin America the term compadre, which means this. But the point is, you and I would immediately, by virtue of baptism, by the virtue of this belonging to the family of God, you and I would be united, and this relationship would be considered to have material obligations, right? Like if you were taken to court as copaters, I would be expected, and I would be shamed if I did not defend you. If you were even now in Latin America, the corporal works of mercy are instituted by virtue of this expanded family. Like if you're sick, all of your spiritual kin who are established through baptism and also through confirmation are expected to visit you. I mean, it's law if law has any meaning, namely that you are punished through shame and other more direct methods if you would be so scummy as to not visit your spiritual kin when they were sick and to not make provisions for their burial, etc. So what I mean to say is already within Christianity, you have the burgeoning of a new culture of obligations, of mutual aid, of assistance, of work, of customs that is present precisely at the moment of someone becoming Christian at all. So it is the vision of Christendom is one of the expansion of what we know to be so good and beautiful within the familial relationship out into all relationships, so that even to the point that when I approach, say, a king, my expectation is that he will treat me like a son. And now we don't have this expectation anymore because we've departed so far from this. But you can see how in a world in which the expectation is the expansion of the familial relationship achieved by grace through Christ over and against claims of just simple blood, etc. When this is the very MO of a society, of course, this ends up in lay associations that are characterized as brotherhoods. I mean, it's simply, I don't want to say it's inevitable because it's always free, but it simply flows from the logic of family that is right there at the beginning.
I think it's safe to say it is inevitable in that it's the normative mode. So the apostolate I work for is called Fraternus, and its primary aim, the goal, if you will, the shared mission, and to use language as common and helpful when you're dealing with average American men, is the salvation of your children. And that begins, instead of thinking in terms of youth ministry, which I presume in England they have this too, this invention of youth ministry, which does many good things. But just logically, the thought of youth ministry is, how do we reach our youth today? Which the joke we like to toss around, what do you mean reach your youth? They live with you, you pay for their cell phone. If you can't reach them, who are you going to reach? What does that even mean? Got to reach youth today. That's not a problem. They're right there. They're in the next room listening awkwardly to your committee meeting, right? The problem is that they can't reach us. There is no us. And men can generally nod their heads to that. But when we get to the point in Fraternus, and I'm part of trying to establish a local chapter here where there's a stop, there's a break, this is the hurdle that I'm not sure I'm willing to get over, is to say that the men in the room, you actually already are brothers.
Right.
You are brother, and I don't mean you're like brothers. That's a fun theme. You're much more brothers than your language that's really actually foreign to someone who's not going to go anywhere and like missionary disciple. That doesn't really mean much to them. Yes, I understand. Yes, they're missionary. Yes, they're a disciple. But even the term disciple fades away in the New Testament, gives way to fraternity. After the book of Acts, it fades away, and it's the love of the brotherhood, this deepening reality that, oh crap, we actually are brothers. We actually are family. And this comes with obligations that I understand in my bones, and that I'm uncomfortable by that obligation, that now we share things in common, because brothers share things, like all these inevitabilities. When we get to that within Fraternus, that's actually the hurdle for modern man, is that to acknowledge and accept that you actually, as St. Paul said, don't you know you belong to one another, when he's trying to reason with people, don't you know you belong to one another? As we have children together, we want them to reach us. We don't want to do the endlessly difficult and rarely fruitful work of trying to reach them, which is awkward. And then you get men doing silly things instead of them coming to be men. I'm using a lot of generalities. If anyone's offended, I'm sorry. But we want them to come to us. It's that point of fraternity that actually has a lot of logical and natural and normal outcomes that we actually want really badly. And to offer to other men to say, I want you to care for my child's salvation in a way that makes you intervene when you think they might lose it. or if you see them suffering, that you would reach out, because we have a very liberal view with our children, which is don't tell my kid what to do. This is definitely in America. I mean, we definitely feel this. Don't tell my kid what to do. But when all of a sudden we realize, no, we have a shared and mutual concern and love for our children, and that you care for their salvation. When that bridge is crossed, all of a sudden there's wonderful, beautiful relationships and realities that begin to flourish. This trust that grows. There is a hurdle we have to get over before we get there.
Yeah, but Jason, don't you think that some of that hurdle is accentuated in the spiritualizing of everything? What I mean to say is,
yes,
we read the idea of Christian brotherhood, and we don't immediately imagine a guild. We don't immediately imagine a practical work that we share. We don't imagine things like standards of tool use or setting of prices or a master-apprentice relationship. What I mean to say is, more that we make Christian brotherhood something alien and strange to what we would expect with actual brotherhood, then when we claim it of each other, saying, hey, you and I are brothers to each other, we're just sort of awkwardly looking at each other across the room and wondering why we have such an intense commitment. And then we start to spiritualize it and say, and so what should we do? I guess we should, maybe we should pray for each other, for instance.
Yeah. Hold each other accountable,
right,
which are all good things.
No.
Well, let me give you a practical. So in the Fraternus chapter in Birmingham, I said that out loud on purpose. That's how we say it here. Birmingham, Alabama. There's a huge chapter there. They have 150, 200 men. And the two things that they have done collectively. Now, this is not baked into the program. This is not in the manual of Fraternus. This has nothing to do. These are men in a particular place. This is what they've done when they pooled their money together and realized, hey, collectively, we have more money together than individually. They built a massive mobile altar that now apparently is employed by the diocese for processions. It's a very beautiful that we're able to use at different locations, and they set up these almost like Chartres pilgrimage, sites of this beautiful, wonderful altar. Okay, so they did that first, and then they all bought a massive set of wedding stuff, the stuff you need for weddings, because weddings are an industry that has been taken away from families, and you now feel this huge pressure to have these feasts and the caterers and all that stuff. And we don't do our own feasts as Christians. Not even at the weddings of our children do we handle our own feasting. We pay for that to be done. So they've collectively bought. I never even would have thought of this because I'm not conditioned to think this way. I would like to be. I'd like to be a better brother. But their children started getting married, and they started paying these people outside of their community who didn't care and were skimming cream from the high pressure that we have of the marriage industrial complex.
Yeah.
And they have all sorts of catering things and tents and utensils and cookware. And I thought that is the weirdest thing to me out of inexperience, but that is an extremely logical, practical, money-saving, festive, uber nerdy Catholic thing to do with money amongst a group of men. You can just see the dads. You know how we can save some money and have a good party at the same time is let's share a common set of a marriage party. So anyway, just to confirm, yes, this is a very practical thing. And it's not spiritual. It's not just, or it ought not be, but it can so easily become, all right, here we are sitting around the circle again. How you doing with porn this week?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's because most lay Catholics are still operating within this secularist paradigm where liberalism is not itself to be challenged. We just have to navigate within that social architecture and find a way of individually or at least familiarly being Catholic, rather than recognizing. This is why I think close historical study of the Christian social order is so vital, because you see that there is another way. And that liberalism was this satanic creation, which was designed to destroy the Christian social order. And so what we need to do is destroy liberalism to restore the Christian social order. And your colleague, Mr. Barnes, Andrew Willard-Jones, has written very eloquently about how the leitmotif of the High Middle Ages was this dynamic movement towards Christian perfection for the whole faithful, inspired by the monasteries initially, following the Gregorian reforms, and it extended to all stations and all roles in society.
Right.
And what struck me in Ross's book, actually, Mr. Craig, was how he mentions the inspiration of the Franciscans, which also started as a lay penitential movement. So you've got this dynamic within the High Middle Ages, where this transformation of society, this intense localism is flowering across all stations in life. Perhaps this might be a good point to just discuss a little bit about the economic functions of the guilds, because this was worker ownership of the means of production. This was a closed shop. They were self-regulating. They had quality controls. They had price controls. They had labor controls, while operating what one author called an internal moral economy, or the moral economy, or the productive economy was for the moral economy. It was intimately integrated. I wonder if you could reflect on that.
Yeah, I think that I know for myself, I think many men, particularly in my area, attempting to live, there's a whole nother topic for us as modern fathers, trying to find ways. I mean, you and I have talked about this both privately and on your channel, which is we would like to find ways where our work is more integrated with being human, right? In our home and our family also. And some of us find those means to get there. And then we have recognition that, as Mark was saying, we as fathers and men, if we just get together and spiritualize our brotherhood and just look at each other and no, those are good things too. Everyone loves sitting around the fire, perhaps having a decent, it's good to be united in the truth and to discuss and have conversation around that. That's good. I mean, that's what, the university as a community of friends at leisure. But at the same time, we have work to do, and finding ways to make that work is our great challenge. I was astounded reading that book and other books like it, how intertwined their economy, their quote unquote spiritual life, it was a whole. They could not in their imagination separate these things. Whereas my great difficulty of being completely formed by liberalism, which we all have to admit, we are formed. This is the air we breathe. Finds that a huge challenge. So the economics though of limiting themselves to their place and each other does have particularly amongst farmers, a consistent tradition, because farming, when capitalism is let loose on farming, it always destroys farmers. Because if you tell a farmer a bushel of corn is X dollars, well, he's going to grow as many bushels of corn as possible. Which is why Wendell Berry writes knowingly of his father's very successful system. I can't recall the name of it, but it was essentially a guild. His father was a lawyer and put together an agreement amongst the tobacco growers of Kentucky, the Burley Tobacco Cooperative or something like that. And what they did was they bound themselves together by limiting production for the good of the other people, for the good of the other farmers. And they maintained up through recent times a culture and a way of life around farming tobacco in Kentucky. And it wasn't until they removed the economic parameters that they grew that then they lost their way of life that they had shared and that they had valued and that they had genuinely wanted to protect, that they did not want to escape or flee from, or there was no oppression. It was outside market forces that forced them off that. So there is a consistent way amongst farmers that, yes, we need to make sure we're providing for our households, for our community, and economically. But when you limit yourself and bind yourself to your community and a group of people, and you are pursuing those things as a common good instead of just being consumerist goods, right, that come and go, that has that is the state, or is what I've come to think and hope for my own life, is that those are the stabilizing culture building realities, that once we can bind ourselves together in economics, which is, we hear that when I say bind, I mean, it's immediately limiting, but if it's familial, if it truly is fraternal, then I would say no, rather a fuller human flourishing than if I just live around other people that are co-consumers with me, and we get together for intentional community, because it won't happen unintentionally. I think that economic factor, I have experienced it significantly more in a rural and agrarian setting, as limited as that is. I don't want to make it sound like I'm in some medieval village with thatched roofs everywhere. It's very difficult, but there is the shared economy in a small local area of hay, and who's, I'm buying hay from someone I know, and I'm selling milk to someone I know. I mean, these things, I can only imagine the goodness if we were intertwined economically in ways that really protected and preserved one another. But we're obviously, all those people that I'm discussing are not. We don't share the same faith. We're disparity of cult amongst my people here.
I mean, the presumptions that we bring to history often make it very difficult to see it for what it is. And one of the presumptions of modern capitalism is obviously the idea of the pursuit of one's individual good. And where this is considered as a norm, where we consider society as normally composed of a multitude of individuals all pursuing their own individual good, and then making contracts on that basis, making truces, making stalemates, going to war. But basically, the society is composed of those individuals. When that is our anthropology, then when we look at the Middle Ages, what we can't help but see the guilds as a suppression of the individual, right? What we see is, well, the methods are fixed, the prices are fixed, the tools are shared. We see a certain, what you might refer to as collectivism, precisely because we're coming at it with the presumption that those people that make up the guild don't really share in a common good. They don't really belong to each other. They really are just individuals. And so then that system, that collective system that they're involved in, is a kind of restraint of their individual power. And then we tell the story of history as one in which the unshackling of commerce and technology and trade from these religious constraints was essentially an enlightenment. Like what the reason that well, it's interesting as we're bringing all our presumptions to bear in here on this, but we imagine the dissolution of the religious order of society as the blossoming and flourishing of the individual, which leads to our current paradigm, which is namely that you pursue your own good as established by yourself with as much abandon as you can muster up. And you shuffle off any attempts to limit or restrain that pursuit of individual good by an ostensible common good, which is always looked on with suspicion. But in the Middle Ages, this simply wasn't a real presupposition. Were you to describe this, you would simply be describing the vice of greed as normal, and you would have been laughed at because it's not normal. It's not the way people ought to be. I mean, even in the pagan philosophers, the basic presumption that the common good is prior to the individual good held. And so for these folks, the understanding that you flourished as a body corporately necessitated the protection of the body, namely you and your brothers. And so to be involved, I mean, and this is simply obvious in the family, like in the family, if we all pursued our own individual good, we would divorce. Brother would turn against brother, and the marriage and the family wouldn't last. But this was, again, to return to the last point, this is the goal of Christianity, is to make what attains in the family true of the entire social reality. namely that if we are bonded together, then we should limit our own pursuit of the individual good for the sake of the common good in which we all participate, right? So if that means that I don't sell my labor for cheaper than the rest of the members of the guild and thereby undercut them all, then so be it. And we can't help but think of this as some great sacrifice, or a felt heavy hand of limitation, as if everyone really wanted to sell their own labor for cheap, but they were oppressed by these sort of religious norms of honesty and fairness and distributive justice and such.
Yeah. Belonging and family and stability and culture. Right.
But I think we don't even have to pretend about that anymore. What I mean is, we live in a current society in which everyone can, to some extent, pursue the individual good that they can sort of muster up for themselves, so long as they're wealthy. Everyone can do what they want, I guess, but what we live in is an obvious wasteland in which the basic goods that we hold in common aren't available to us. So we are not really allowed. We're allowed to pursue any good so long as it is in the common good. I mean, to say what you mentioned, stable families, living in one place, having wealth in the land, having ownership rather than rent and wage slavery. I mean, these things are simply not available to us. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I can't, you're saying it quickly. We're moving on past it. I think the logic of the family, of the body, of corporality, that the church is a body. That is what the church is. And even before we hand over the baby to the godparents, as we were talking about, the co-fathers, there's still the reality that even if you have a conversion, you can't baptize yourself. That it's impregnated in the very fact and the truth and the reality of the body of Christ, that to be saved is to belong to this body. And a lot of us today, those are broad. A lot of us today, we sense the loneliness, isolation, and the destruction of these things that we claim as conservative men to value: family, community, all this stuff. We feel the loss of them and we want to recover them. And sometimes, though, we don't realize, though, we have been conditioned by a society that we're atomized individuals vying for power that is limited. And, every now and then there's creative destruction. I mean, Cain kind of had to kill Abel, it just happens. It's just part of, growth and change, and you got to get with the times, that what happens when all of us as individuals, and I'm saying us as Catholics, attempting to do something different in a world that we perceive has gone, whatever, that we don't even know how to arrange ourselves. So we discuss arranging ourselves in authority structures and hierarchies, and we become interested in things like monarchy, which is great. But because we don't have the intuition and the guts and the imagination of the family and of a body and of a brotherhood, something growing as a whole, as a body, you think about it differently in the forms of shared common goods instead of brokered power and power and order. So an example would be, within the family, there's this constant debate about women and men, or not constant, but it flares up because women have been liberated from the tyranny of the father as the head of the home. But when we discuss that, we think of it we talk about it only in forms of shared power and authority and submission, instead of as a body. Whereas when Aquinas talks about the faculties of the human person, and the woman represents the body of the family, right? If the father is the head, the woman is the body. He talks about the body having certain senses, that if the head does not listen and receive from the body, then it cannot do its function. It can't function. It can't be its head. So, and under the virtue of temperance, and talks about that you have to listen to your body. You can't not eat food. The hungry man doesn't need philosophy. He needs a sandwich, right? And within the home, men who are desiring to recover their headship end up recovering an authoritarian, tyrannical running of their home, as if it's a business, or if it's a military, or if it's like our modern society, which is brokering for power. Whereas when you see a home that has healthy relationships, that's operating as a body, that changes the way you understand that quote unquote, authority structure. It is corporality. And then that changes the way you understand evangelization. We're bringing people into a body here. We're not just converting them. We're initiating them, right? The church uses the language where the sacraments of initiation. So initiation always is an anthropological concept. That is, how does a body of people bring someone who's not one of them in? So that's what we're actually doing with evangelization. We're bringing the body in, which is why it's not just discipleship, multiplication of individuals, reaching individuals, a pyramid scheme of converting people. Notice that we're a family and we're bringing someone into the family. It changes everything. So you keep mentioning that. I come from a family of divorce. I love Wendell Berry, who just defines our era as, he doesn't use the term liberalism at all. He uses the term divorce. We have been divorced from one another. We're not just radical individuals. We're divorced people. And we're trying to put things together that have been divorced. And that's the difficulty. Sorry, I realize now we're getting way far away from guilds as I'm saying that. And it's helpful that my wife with the new baby that I mentioned at the beginning is texting me like, you done yet? Because, we're all modernists with our phones here, but
I'm glad that in one of your recent broadcasts, Mr. Barnes, you brought up how there is this false dichotomy that is created by the loss of the home as a domestic economy, as a productive unit, and between, on the one hand, the pathology of feminism on the one hand, and then the 1950s sort of absent wage earning father on the other hand, and the transformation of the home into a purely consumptive unit. And that dichotomy is going to continue really until the complementarity of the sexes is realized in productive, fruitful ways, as they were with crafts, artisan families, guilds. And it's quite right that you keep bringing it back to family, because they are the brotherhood, but also this pattern of fatherhood was right the way through Christendom, from the peasant to the lord, from the lord to the king, from the king to the Holy Roman Emperor, from the priest to the bishop to the pope, from the monk to the abbot, and also from the apprentice to the master. And the head of a guild was like a small noble among its members. He was the most respected. He had the respect due to a leader, and he was like a venerable grandfather, highly valued for his wisdom, skills, and age. And it seems that, in this very transient economy that we have, where there's so much obsolescence and this kind of acquisition of new skills within these modern industries, technology, for example, is so rapid that it militates against the cultivation of grandfatherly figures like that in a particular trade. You can't have, a grandfatherly figure who's going to teach you programming because it changes every month or whatever. Whereas you can when it comes to, carpentry, when it comes to candlestick making. And that's how you have the beautiful fruits of the Christian material culture, which is the most magnificent the world has ever known.
That's right. Christians want to be saints, but when we want to be saints, we always want to be icons, as it were. I'm thinking of the image of the icon, where we reach a stage of perfection that's so powerful that we can sum it up just by an image and then a symbol, say a lily in the hand, to represent this achievement. And I think modernity is poised against precisely the idea that by fixing standards of work, by fixing forms of life through law and custom, that one of the things this enables is for people to stand out as real models of perfection. Sometimes it's best to step back from the Middle Ages and just look at the thing and say, well, what's so different about it? And one of the things that immediately strikes everyone is that every occupation in the Middle Ages seemed to be haloed by a particular sort of character, right? So there was such a thing as a miller, there was such a thing as a carpenter, there's such a thing as a mason. And it was so obvious that they could be recognized by their dress, They had a particularity and a specificity about them. And this might sound strange, like why desire a specificity of dress? Why desire a particularity? Well, it's actually an expression that these trades were located within guilds, which made them genuine objects of imitation. Like there was a genuine path of becoming the perfect mason, right? There's a, if you will, to becoming an icon of the mason. Maybe picking a mason within a Catholic conversation is jarring. I could be a carpenter, right? But you think about
Rick Mason.
But you think about this, because it's actually very fascinating that we have no. Well, let me put it this way: children desire this, right? What does a child want to be when it grows up? Well, almost inevitably, it wants to be someone in uniform, right? So boys tend to want to be firemen, maybe police officers, but they do so. What they desire is shaped by the clear symbol of an achieved perfection, that there is a form of life established in law, protected by custom, by which one can achieve a kind of perfection. And this is revealed in dress, in hierarchy, right? In being that grandfatherly figure, say, but also in just being a master of the trade. And that's a recognized reality, recognized in even social status, sure, but even recognized liturgically in the way that they would process and such. The child desires models of perfection. Why? Because the child is imperfect. And so when we show the child a person in uniform, what they see, and granted, in an immature way that needs itself to be perfected, but what they see is someone who has attained an ideal, right? The fireman is not just Bob, wearing a suit to the child. The fireman is a sort of godly-like figure because when they put on the uniform, they have actually become what they, strive to be. And that's what childhood is a striving to be something particular and solid. But as you mentioned, in a modern economy in which all restraint and limit is seen as a sort of wickedness, what we actually produce is people who work jobs for the sake of the production of profits, which involve no definite state of perfection, right? Like you wouldn't know what a software designer should wear. You wouldn't know what the job, because the pursuit is ultimately of money and not of the perfection of a particular trade or craft, which is what's protected by the guild. What the child then receives is a world full of indefinite figures. And then, so what does he learn to do? Well, he learns to pursue money like everyone else, because there's less and less, I should say, clear models of perfection, of something achieved. And it seems to me like, this is something that an age of capitalism, precisely because it always has to reinvent itself in order to produce new commodities that people need to buy in order to maintain itself. It's always going to be warring against any fixed forms of life, any clearly recognizable paths of achievement. It's always going to be at war with these things. And I think that's
the tyranny for children is their loss into mass culture, right, as the Front Porch Republic people call it, mass culture, which is just, sometimes I hear the servers before mass preparing, because and I hear them discussing just whatever the latest movie is that they're watching. And I'm thinking to myself, really, this is the mass culture has invaded the vocal air, like this space, this air I'm breathing in my church. This is just driving me crazy. Or fashion, and just, whatever is new and being, ground through, because you're right. And there's a reason. I'm sure this is true completely in the West, but there's a reason that they target our children, because of their insecurity. They're not secure as a child by nature. Their immaturity means I have not reached something yet. So in that instability and insecurity, yes, they grasp fast, whereas the fireman is stable, right? And the fashionable person is at least ahead
Sure. Yeah.
They're not falling behind. So the insecurity of immaturity, right? Those two things go hand in hand. The insecure, the immature.
You can imagine the Middle Ages, and the reason for the guilds is to establish clear icons of perfection, not simply within a spiritual realm, right? Because there are masters of prayer and the saints proper, but to really make of all lay people a saint in a sort of analogous sense, right? Not in the sense of canonization, but in a kind of poetic reading of the word canonization, right? Canon means law. So the saint is the one who's canonized, right? Who becomes like unto a law for the rest of us, right? And in some way, the guilds were doing for labor and for craft and for trade. To say this was a Christian enterprise, I think just makes sense, because it's what the church is obviously doing for prayer and for good works, which is namely establishing by custom and law visible icons of perfection that resisted precisely what we can't resist now, which is to say a loss of brotherhood, a loss of models, a loss of father figures. It's like they wanted to make everyone a father figure. It's like, well, if we're going to have some people who are grinding grain, well, then we should make them grind grain in such a way that they become exemplary, a father figure of,
Yeah, they become the master, which is where we get the word mister. I mean, that.
Yeah.
Although Miller is a bad example, though, because they got a bad rap in the Middle Ages, because that was proto-technological sort of crisis for a lot of
That's
people.
right. Well, the technological thing is interesting. As I hear you talk about that, it might be the setting that I'm in with my children, is that we are still surrounded, and this is absolutely related. And I don't know if we'll have time now. Maybe we'll do part 2 of this. The rise of capitalism, the loss of the crafts and the trade, and what again Wendell Berry would call the vocation, because we as Catholics, we call vocation by, are you a priest or not? Have you discerned your vocation? Mm-hmm. Whereas there is a greater sense when you sanctify all of the trades, all the things you're doing. That what is the work that I am suited to particularly? And that's an exciting thing. I have a son who every day we wake up early to milk cows, and he's only 10, and he is obsessed with this idea of what is the work he is suited to do. Mm-hmm. Right? What is the work? He's obsessed with this. What do you think I'm going to do? And sometimes I find myself saying, "Oh, I hope you're a saint, whatever you are," which is true, of course. But he wants to know, yeah, I know that. But will I be a farmer, or will I? And he has these particular things. There's a firehouse down the road. He's a fireman in these things. That the craftsmen, even today, craftsmen of physical labor, of work, of producing something, of making something, they absolutely have, and they do it naturally. They absolutely have ways that they dress. Yeah. And they will give you will get a Carhartt hat with certain things, which, and I don't know if you have Carhartt in England, but it's a brand of workwear that's been sadly, I remember when someone called me I grew up with Carhartt. It's a brand of working clothes. It's just very, it looks like this. This is what it is. It's just kind of metal and duck cloth, as we call it. And you'll get a Carhartt hat, which today is way more expensive than necessary. You can get a knockoff, but they'll still give you one. It's like, all right, you made it on the crew. And so, there is a way that even on a construction site, sometimes plumbers, framers, masons, they will dress a certain way. And even in the United States, there'll even be particular races of people will be grouped up in these things, and they're coming together for the common task of building a home. But I think what we're describing, what you said, firemen and policemen, which is true. But I think it's just the visible sign that I am doing something with my hands and my whole being and my body that I will be good at. And that it gives me security in the form of dress, in the form of the way of life. And not only that, and in fact, way before that, the thing you mentioned that we've brushed on is the ideas of apprenticeship. The ideas of, and not just of, I'm going to teach you how to do something effectively, but I will be like a father to you. The way Paul was a father to Timothy in these spiritual, I will be like a father teaching you. If you have ever been formed by, which I have, there are men that formed me in how to do things. Those men are like fathers to who I am, because who I am is absolutely wrapped up in what I know how to do and what I do on a regular basis. And I'll never be able to do these things without, in some way, and at some point, considering these people. So the apprenticeships not only protected, but they had effective means of initiating people into a way of life. And that's what, and I think when we say firemen and policemen, they have formed, or even military, they have very effective forms of initiation into their craft. Whereas I think other things that are not either service based, like firemen and policemen and the military, or craft based, where you have to master this, but where everyone is sort of after the profit alone, and where the only shared dress that we show off, again, going back to fashion, is that I can afford X, Y, and Z. You don't care how I afforded it. You're just amazed that I can. That's a completely different mode of appreciation of other people, of being mentored, that I long for, that the spirit and the reality of a guild, which is not beyond us, is that, there's a man across the street from my home now, who quit his job as a banker. And, before he quit his job as a banker, he called me and said, what is a work around your place that needs to be done? Because I've got to get out of the banking. I'm dying. And I said, well, we need a butcher. I mean, I have slots reserved with butchers far away from me for animals that I don't even own yet. That's how far behind and how difficult right now we have for having certified butchered meat that we can resell, legally where I am. He said, great. He quit his job and he's building a butcher shop, and he has a distinct way of dress, and he will have an apron that butchers wear, and he's across the street, and he's a Catholic man, and he has children, and my children are older than his children. So I hope my children make it in, a couple of them, to apprentice with him, in which case he will provide them with an apron, presumably. Perhaps he'll monogram it because we've got the ability, and he will provide them, and he will want to teach them to be a master. And it turns out down the road, a new guy has moved here. And he says, for me, cutting meats was not a job; it was a vocation. He used that language, and I don't know him to be a religious man or to be nerdy like the three of us on this show are right now. What do you say, Tom? It's a show, a podcast?
I don't know. Broadcast.
Come on, I need some lingo. But anyway, all that to say is, I think what you're bringing up is that the guilds are hard to recover if the work itself does not actually necessitate and call forth, associations where the thing and the stuff you're wearing are not only religious, but they are practical, and they're born from a shared thing that we're doing. And we tend to begin to dress like and act like the people that we are working with.
Yeah, and I think it's just, when you look at the Middle Ages, you see, it just seems so clear to me, maybe it's not, that you can imagine looking at the desire for perfection and then seeing the kind of stability that working together within familial relationships provided to not just the particular trade, but to society as a whole, who can now count on stable prices, who can now count on spiritually motivated men who are seeking to become masters of trades and to produce essentially quality controlled goods, that the whole society would benefit from this marvelous exercise of Christian restraint on vice and promotion of virtue, to such an extent that they codified it. I mean, this, I think, is what really freaks out the modern consciousness. It's not that we could sit here all day and describe how good it would be to live in a certain way, to dress in a certain way, to have fathers teaching sons, to have masters being fatherly towards apprentices. But what gets scary, I think, is when they say, and we're going to make it a law. It's going to be a custom that we enforce, right? It's not simply that, this is a good private option within a myriad of private options that you could live together in this manner or work together in this manner, but rather to tear apart this fabric that's being woven is a criminal act. It's to do something violent to a community that's seeking its perfection, and it's to seek your own good as opposed to the common good, which is Augustine says that's all sin,
right? Which would bring shame to a point, such an extent that you wouldn't want to even be in that community anymore were you to violate it.
Right,
very effective and useful shame.
Yeah, and then you get to sort of when you comprehend that, you see how the guild structure is just opposed to economic and cultural liberalism. which says that what we really are individuals within a free playing field that's sort of held out by the state somehow, don't ask them how, in which we compete in our pursuit of individual good. And you can see how this makes a taboo against the guild, namely that it isn't just saying, oh, isn't this lovely, to make sort of fatherhood the guiding principle, not just of the particular household, but of the master-apprentice relationship, but actually is willing to say, no, this is worth protecting with the force of law.
Yeah, I happen to have, when I was searching for the book that we're supposed to be quoting from, but we haven't, I found the magazine here.
Mm-hmm.
It would actually seem that our customs and laws, as Colin Miller, in his article, he put, once in place, these very structures of life now hold Catholics apart, whereas the structures, the laws you're describing, bound them together. Our current ones hold us apart. Now, even when a family wants to live a practice-based Catholicism, i.e. doing stuff, they must contend with the fact that these economic structures have a tight hold on their lives and the lives of their friends, i.e. the economy we actually live in, without whom they cannot build the internal goods necessary to community. Which is why a friend of mine was here, Dr. Jared Stout. I think he's been on this channel. Mm-hmm. Anyway, he was here. We were talking about urban Catholic communities that they talk out of both sides of their mouth, which is, I'm too busy to do anything. I cannot commit to anything. I can't commit to anything. And on the other side, they say, I am so lonely and desirous of community. I really need to do something. Without whom they cannot build. So difficult as the struggle may be, however, the reforging of these truly common goods remains exactly the condition for the church to be true to its communal nature, and hence in a way to be the church at all, and for liberalism not to win. So that's a very difficult thing for us, because we are not going to have laws that are going to bind us together. And so in a certain way, the guild as a lay association, meaning both us as Catholic men, but also us independent of whatever our state is doing, which is not binding us together as Catholic men, or as Catholic families, I should say, as households, as communities, that it's necessary for us to find ways to restrict ourselves to one another. That's what the guilds did. And I think that's an excellent point, Mark, that that's where we do get uncomfortable. As in the air we breathe. I was sitting across the table with a man in my community, and he said, well, I said, aren't we want to care for our children in such a way that we presume that our grandchildren will be. And he said, well, I keep my house. I think he kept his house on, like, you can do Zillow, like the make me an offer and I'll move out of it or something. And he said to me, well, I have to keep my options open. And I thought, in other words, I cannot be committed to you as a friend in a way that means anything. And he did, in fact, move, and he's gone. I thought, wow, we're all just cohabitating to one another. We're not bound in any way. And because, the age of divorce, as Wendell Berry calls it, finding ways to be, married, so to speak, to codify, to become families bound to one another is extremely uncomfortable. Extremely uncomfortable. And I am speaking as growing up in a blue collar, on the way to the job site, listening to Rush Limbaugh every single day. I mean, I know it's uncomfortable for me. That truth's very uncomfortable, but we also love law and love justice. And that is the hurdle. Sorry, I'm just agreeing.
Moderns have this image of the Middle Ages when children study feudalism. The first thing they do is draw a pyramid, which has a certain truth to it. It was hierarchical, but pyramids are pagan. Pyramids are Masonic. The Middle Ages was much more like a crown, where you have different vertices, where it's not that the coopers are better than the leather workers or the masons are better than the glaziers. They're just different. And this corresponds to the reality that it's not so much that God loves us equally, but that God loves us uniquely. Any father, it's not that he loves his children all differently, all equally. It's that he who loves them uniquely, they all have their own place. And that's very much what you realize. And you spoke very beautifully, Mr. Barnes, about the iconography of this for the guilds. You've talked about sanctifying work and sanctification of the temporal sphere, which is the apostolate proper to the laity. And I find that this term of sacrality or sacralization is a useful distinction here, because the sacred is that which touches divine worship or participates in divine worship, whereas the sacral is that which directs one towards the act of worship. And I think that the sacred is proper to the clerical state, and the sacral is proper to the lay state. So the guilds had their patron saints. Their choice of saints was very intuitive. Saint Crispin was patron of shoemakers. The porters recognized Saint Christopher as patron because he had borne the child Christ on his shoulders. The pin makers chose the Nativity as their guild festival because it was said during the Christmas night that the Virgin had fastened the child's swaddling clothes with pins after the manner of nurses. St. Mary Magdalene was patron saint of perfume makers. Servants invoked the active and humble Martha. The tanners had the patron of St. Bartholomew, who was flayed alive, so it wasn't always in the best taste. But these were the patron saints who they dedicated altars, chapels, even churches to. And the economy of grace operated as the church does, beyond the temporal sphere. The guilds provided masses for the souls of guild members. And this was a very important part. The brotherhood extended into eternity. And the lay initiative here was really important. For example, the cult of Corpus Christi, which you mentioned, was adopted as a feast by the church around 1318. So this is the period of the first of all 12th and 13th centuries. This period of Eucharistic revolution, it's been called. But the feast owed its wide dissemination to the efforts largely of lay fraternities. These were the bodies that organized the processions for the liturgy of that feast day and fostered understanding of the doctrine. And the didactic efforts of the clergy, the preaching, the doctrinal preaching, was complemented by a variety of plays, the mystery plays, by the guilds, the other imagery that was supplied by the guilds. So this is sacrality. This is the kind of, the infusion of the gospel into wider society, where even if you're staying in a room, the window is arched so that before you sleep, you think of the celestial realm, and your mind is your heart's elevated in prayer. And I think that one thing that struck me in Ross's book, actually, Mr. Craig, that perhaps you remember, is when he talks about the relationship between the clergy and the guilds. And this is, I think, a barrier to these kind of lay associations today, is sadly the clericalism that we have today. I'll just read this passage because it was so striking. Quote, "A priest found morally or otherwise wanting was subject to dismissal. Similar provisions applied to the 4 priests employed in the 15th century by the Holy Cross Guild of Stratford-upon-Avon. They provided daily masses in the guild chapel at 6, 7, 8, and 9 in the morning, with the possibility of an earlier service if one of the guild had to leave town on business. As at Lichfield, these clerics likewise lived under strict supervision in a shared house within the complex of guild buildings. Their daily movements were controlled, and the sound of any noise or slander would lead to expulsion. Thus the flock watched the shepherd." Now, can you imagine that kind of lay accountability of the clergy occurring today? The lay power has been so denuded in modernity that and clericalism is so prominent with the loss of the nobility, the monarchies who would hold the clergy accountable. Here we see it with laity. You'd have it in parish councils where the priest has to look into the eyes of the local knight, and it cannot just do whatever he wants. And I think what we're lacking today is often within lay associations is this lay leadership and this lay
Power.
Lay power. It's lay power, which, our Lord established two orders in the church, the lay and the clerical. And there is meant to be this, obviously the clerical is above the lay, but there is meant to be nevertheless this lay accountability that's held over the clergy, and vice versa.
Yeah, in the book, I was fascinated when they spoke about, or when he spoke about the tension where the lay associations were doing so well at, in a sense, sacralizing, as you put it, the what they were up to, what they were doing, that it almost had a quasi liturgical, or I should say, para-liturgical function that made some of the clergy uncomfortable. That they would have, feasts after the Mass, for example, or a blessed bread after the Mass, which in some places there was not tension. I mean, this was a custom in France, for example, that the blessed bread that would be shared, whereas other places it was, well, these people are thinking a little too much about this bread, But that I was fascinated in reading the book at how robust the lay development of sort of around the cult that they had, their saints, their particular feasts, at how much arose among themselves, just particular to this one guild in this one place in this one village, how much of their time was occupied with these sorts of things, with ritualizing and ceremonial ways, just the fact of their guild, and how that sometimes that made the clergy uncomfortable. What are they really doing in that hall over there? I need to, well, you're not the chaplain, you haven't been initiated. You're right, and it's hard to even imagine the parish council having that sort of thing. I can speak of, during the government forced lockdowns during COVID, there were places in my local area where whether or not the church was opened or not had a lot to do with whether or not the laity showed up and demanded it.
Right.
Because they knew where the priest was and that he was home. And they, with great force, I don't want to be careful here, but with great force said, get out of your house and get to the altar. We are here and we expect you to be here. And that demand kept churches open in this area, whereas others that did not have, and that was born from, particular, force amongst laity that had bound themselves together and collectively did not simply wait for the demand. The same thing happened in some fraternist chapters where they just simply demanded that we will be here and we demand the doors that we pay for to be opened. And they were. So I think it does happen. But yes, I think.
Well, it can be troubling, but I think it's troubling because we have a lack of shared mission between laity and clergy. What I mean to say is, when do you accept the authority of another person? Well, usually it's because you are actually involved in a common good. And so that person is seeking your good, even if it's sometimes, butts against you, right? This is obvious within the family, of course. When we view the laity as something other than the church, which I think is the specific effort of liberalism, is to give the idea that the church is somehow a clerical reality administered to a laity, which isn't precisely the church, but is rather this new thing, a secular reality, a reality that would be what it was in world history, whether or not, there was a church. And where this is believed, paradoxically, it leads to a sort of clericalism, right? Which is that only when you can say the lay person is about what Andrew Willard-Jones calls the business of the peace and the faith as one unified effort of sanctification, one unified effort of perfection, can you, as a priest with certainly a spiritual authority, give way to a genuine use of a temporal authority, which is for the sake of the same end, namely the perfection of the world, the sanctification of the world. What happens in modernity is that we see ourselves as not sharing the same mission. This is why the big part of why the Second Vatican Council was so very necessary, right? Is it was actually expressing to Catholics, once again, what we already knew institutionally in the Middle Ages, that we have a particular lay vocation for spreading the faith through the sanctification of the temporal order. Well, it's interesting that we think of that as some novel thing, as if like now when I go to work and I have some kind of personal intention of sanctifying the temporal order, I'm for the first time, living as the laity, realizing itself. When if you look at the Middle Ages, they were actually building institutions for the sanctification of work. We're trying to sanctify the temporal order. They really did it. What does a sanctified temporal order look like? Well, it probably looks like a kind of work that is a liturgy, a kind of work that is a form of praise and honor of the saints. I mean, these stories from the Middle Ages, they surprise me less and less, because when I think people look to the Middle Ages, what they expect to see is a sort of a laity cowering under a sort of technically superior spiritual authority. But what they actually see is a constant negotiation of rights, of duties, of authorities in the plural between clerics and lay people, precisely because they're about the same mission. When you're all working towards the same goal, you can fight about it without like the fear of the whole thing being disrupted. If you've ever like worked on a job site, then you know that there are battles of authority that happen because you are about a common political work. Whereas the description that modernity tries to give is always that, there's a spiritual thing that's after spiritual ends, and then there's temporal ends that have nothing to do with it. But it's just not true. We really are about the common.
The books, Duffy's work, Eamon Duffy, the stripping of the altars and the voices of Morbeth, the intertwining lives of the clergy and the laity and their discussions and arguments it's fascinating how intertwined they really are. And I think in Joseph Ratzinger's book, The Meaning of Christian Brotherhood, where he makes the case that it's actually, quite natural to see the priest not only, and perhaps not even firstly as father, but as brother in the community, is not something that was lost on them, that he was set apart as a priest, yet he was a brother.
Precisely the lay people that become priests. I mean, this is what always gets missed. It's like these aren't two ontological categories. Like the laity in perfecting themselves produce the religious, right? So what we are seeing is the whole society about the common work. And this is lost in the modern sort of clericalism, in which like the priests are almost like an alien race that just happened to have lay parents.